Okay, in this episode, it's part 4 of Paul and Women as part of our series about Paul and women on women and Jesus and women and their differences. And the point of this is to bring out that do we want to associate Jesus with someone who talks this way about women, who is not following the law, is making up claims that are from what's known as the Pharisaic law or halakha, and that's not Jesus rejected the halakha, rejected the Pharisaic law as made up, just concocted. And so do we want our Lord Jesus associated with someone who says women cannot speak in church, women cannot ask questions in church, women must go home and ask their husbands questions about what's going on, and then they have to study in silence? There's all kinds of other commands related to this. So the answer should be no, and I'm going to give you a very important quote from Professor Eisenman. He's a Jewish person, and he's objectively telling Christians, I don't know why you're putting up with Paul. I don't know why you're allowing him to be associated with someone who talks so differently than him. And so he just lays it all on the line. And so I want you to listen to his quote. It's in the next slide. And that should inspire us to listen with attentiveness, like we need to convince other people. We need to remove Paul from the Bible. Put him in an appendix. Say, this is the false prophet. This is the heretic. And we're going to put him in an appendix because he actually does prove a lot of important things about Jesus. Jesus says he prophesied about the one whose name would be least. Pauxililis contracts to Paulus, which is Paul's name, least in Latin. And so Jesus prophesied about him. So we need him to prove the genius of Jesus, the power of Jesus, and the knowledge that Jesus knew this guy would come. But he condemned him in Matthew 5:17. We need to bring that out. But on the other hand, we can't let him just have people who pick up the Bible and see Paul and they think this is the way Jesus thinks. Jesus being associated with someone whose doctrine is false and evil, as we'll see. Okay, so this is from Professor Eisenman's book from 2006, The New Testament Code, The Cup of the Lord, and so on. And it's page XXVII, so that's the preface, and it's page 28. And this is what he says. If there had been things that had been done and said in his name, in Jesus' name, that were not his, it is my view that he would expect, nay, require, his most sincere, ardent, and dedicated supporters and followers to find this out, there being nothing worse than having things done in or attributed to one's name in either life or legacy that were not one's own. This would be his charge to them and their obligation. He's talking about this issue about Paul. He's the one who exposed that what he can see in the Dead Sea Scrolls is that there's a spouter of lies being fought by James the Just, the Zadik. And so they're using monikers. Everybody knows James the Just's name is the Just One, Zadik. Everyone knows who the spouter of lies is. The debate is over Habakkuk 2 verse 4. Are you saved by faith? Is that what Habakkuk meant? And the Ebion, the church, our church, original church called the Ebionites, they're saying no, that word in Hebrew is emunah, which means faithfulness, and Eisenman knows that too. And so he's saying, how do the Christians tolerate this when this puts a bad reflection on Jesus Christ? And that is a real problem. So every Christian who doesn't decide that we need to fight the inclusion of Paul because of the horrible things he says that we don't even follow, we think are wrong, we think are immoral, and we won't follow. And I'm going to show you where he gets this and a few other things that are really atrocious. So anyway, that's a moral exhortation from a disinterested party who doesn't have any belief in Christianity at all, except he thinks Jesus deserves some respect. Don't associate Jesus with somebody like this. And he tells you, he says Paul is very insulting and language that he actually says at one point, he says, you might think he's crazy, the way he talks about, cutting off your genitals and things in a religious setting to talk like this. He himself is disgusted, and he's not even a Christian. He's disgusted by Paul as a writer, as a thinker, as in every which way. This is what Christians just, you can't just read the part you like. Oh, love is the kind, love is love. No, you got to read everything. And when it's evil and ugly, you have to call it out. And you have to say, we can't associate this voice with Jesus Christ. But anyway, let's keep going here. I want to show you some stuff that's going to be helpful here. All right, so now we're going to go and examine this passage, must women not speak or inquire at church? But we want to also see what was the garden ideal. So we learn in Genesis 2:18, actually, this is prior to Eve's creation, God saw it, quote, "It is not good that man be alone. I will make him a helpmate." Genesis 2:18. And in Genesis 1:28, which actually comes before it in the passage, is after they've been created. And so then God says, God blessed them, the two, Adam and Eve, saying, and it's a command to both, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and conquer it. So we were supposed to rule the earth. Okay, so now nowhere in the original Bible does God ever say any woman should be silent in the congregation, or all women are subject to any man they encounter, or that a wife should only ask spiritual questions from her own husband. Okay? So we're going to have to figure out, where does this come from? And I'm going to tell you it's called halakha. It means law by sages and rabbis and teachers. And then the view is, what's the majority view? That'd be one test. And the other is, who's the most authoritative rabbi? So we're going to get into that so we can understand what Paul is really referring to when he says, this is the law. He says it's a law that women can't speak in church. Okay. And then after the fall, God says the punishment of Eve was pain in childbirth. Well, this is apparently a mistranslation. I want to refer to the Book of Eden by Bruce C.E. Fleming, and that wasn't actually the punishment, if I recollect here. So we'll get into that in another episode. But what it says is, despite you having more difficulty, your desire will be for your husband. You'll still be, in other words, attracted to acts of procreation despite the pain of childbirth. And then it says he shall rule over you. Now that's not a commandment that he shall rule over you. So the garden ideal was not that the man would rule over her. This was just a consequence of his sin, and now he has this desire to control her and rule over her. But God's not saying it's a good thing, and he's not blessing it. He's just saying it's a fact that you're going to have to deal with this issue now, Eve. So the man's going to overreact, and now what's the garden ideal? To go back to the way it was originally, which is they're joint rulers of earth. Conquer it, both of them together, and as partners in everything. And that's very important, because that seems to be Jesus's modus operandi. So when he says, about divorce, he says, yes, Moses allowed you to divorce, but that was not God's intention from the very beginning. So this was just something God allowed Moses to do because people are sinners. And that's how he's going to allow you to address problems. But it's not, Jesus says that's not God's ideal. That's not what he intended. So I say here, this, just as God's plan was not to allow any divorces from the beginning, and Jesus said God allowed it after the fall due to man's evil stubbornness, it was also not God's original plan to have a husband to rule over his wife. God was always her ideal ruler. God allowed her husband to rule over her only as a penalty on Eve. You know what? It's not even a penalty. It's just simply a fact of life. And it wasn't that she had to submit to it either. It was just simply that's what's going to end up happening. In the garden, husband and wife were equals, and that's the real point here. How do we get back to Eden? And that is a man has to restrain himself from the temptation, from the desire to rule over the woman. God's not blessing you doing it. He just says it's a fact of life to Eve. He's going to try to do this. All right, so this, just as Jesus said we should strive not to take advantage of the law allowing divorce, because the garden ideal is that there should be no divorce, then for the same reason, a husband should strive not to take advantage of this statement that God said you're going to have this desire to rule over your wife. It is contrary to the ideal in the garden period where God alone rules over the woman just as he rules over the man. By refraining from such domination, the husband does not sin, as Genesis 3:16 is not a command upon a husband to rule over his wife. It is merely a penalty. Maybe it isn't even a penalty, because it just simply, it's a fact that God doesn't say this is the consequence of your sin, Eve. It's just simply a consequence of what really man sinned, and now he's going to blame the woman, and God didn't let him off the hook on that excuse, right? So God is just telling Eve this is a fact of life, but it didn't actually penalize her. So I have to take that back. This is an old article, so I grow and I learn every day. So we just and we're trained to think that Eve is being penalized in that regard, and so she's got to deal with this, and it's a mandatory thing that she has to accept it. No, God didn't say she had to accept it either. He just simply said he's going to try to rule over you. Okay. So anyway, I think that's enough of that, and I could show you the Proverbs 31 wife is very dynamic and a co-leader in her home, and this is extolled, and her husband trusts her. She considers the fields and buys it, uses her earnings as she sees fit to plant a vineyard, with no hints that she must run by her husband how to run the house. As verse 10 says, he trusts her, and so, I mean, we could go through the whole Proverbs 31, okay, but we're not going to do that. So we want to get to the passages at issue here. So now we're going to look into where Paul gives these commands about the woman not speaking in church and her being subject to her husband. And we'll pick up in a second. Okay, we're going to read this, and I just want to say before we read it, if children are subject to their parents, right, it means control and direction, meaning that your children have a duty to obey you. Now, this seems to be exactly how Paul is using this term, but in relation between a husband and a wife, which isn't what Genesis said, did it? It just said he will rule over you. Not that God has appointed him to rule over you or you have a duty to obey him, but this is what he's going to want to do. Your husband's going to want to rule over you. His desire is to rule over you. Not that it's a command, and not that it's a duty of the woman to submit either, but it's just a fact of life. She's going to deal with this. So let's read what he says in Titus 2:4-5. He says, so that they may encourage the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be sensible, pure, workers at home, kind, being subject to their own husbands, so that the word of God will not be dishonored. And he says this again in Ephesians 5:24. The wives are subject to their own husbands in everything. So this encourages a wife to be a servant to her husband, which is not commanded in Genesis 3:16. Is merely a condition a woman is under toward her husband, if he so chooses, as a penalty or as simply the consequence of his own sin, this is his desire. However, if you see the garden ideal as the point to emphasize, Paul should rather be instructing the husbands, quote, strive not to dominate or rule over your wife, but show her love and support as an equal partner whose only true ruler is God Yahweh. Leave your wife subject to God Yahweh. She is subject to God, just like at the beginning before your sin, Adam. So Paul should be upholding that ideal that both are equals, raising a family who shoulder a partnership of responsibilities. This is what God in Genesis implied. She was a helpmate, someone matched to his needs to help him, not serve him. God made it clear that the garden ideal of equality was not a forced service of the wife to the husband. A husband should not exploit the penalty or this consequence of his own desires. I think I misread that as a penalty. It's not. It just simply says he's going to desire to rule over you. Okay, so now we're going to see how this then leads to the next subject. This is going to go on in church, and this is kind of the same principle. Let's read this. This is in 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 to 35. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also says the law. Verse 35, and if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. And I'm just going to get to the next verse because we can handle them together. They're almost the same thing. 1 Timothy 2, verses 11 to 12, we similarly read, let a woman learn in silence in all subjection, but I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, rather to be in silence. These are really horrible things.
Because this other idea that the woman has to learn in silence also means that she's not allowed to ask questions. I mean, just learn. Don't ask questions. Just study, but don't talk to me about it. And that's not a good idea. Is a husband and wife, as they read the Bible, can go back and forth and ask questions of each other. So, and this idea of not permitting a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, where'd that come from? I do not permit. By the way, he doesn't say the law. He doesn't here. He doesn't pretend the law is saying that. He's just, I do not permit it. That's not biblical. Okay, it's not in. It's not coming from God. He's not claiming it's coming from God. He's just saying I don't permit it, and it's wrong. I mean, that means if Martha gets educated in between Jesus and Mary and Martha, let's take that dynamic. And Mary was the sister of Martha. Martha sounded like she could have kids. Maybe Mary is a younger girl. Who knows? But eventually, the lessons that Jesus is teaching, they could themselves teach others what Jesus said, right? So by Jesus teaching them, it necessitates they have a duty and obligation to share that teaching, and they can't exclude men from these teachings, because men need to hear the words of Jesus just as much as women. So, but Paul's saying no, even if they had the precious words of Jesus and actually met Jesus in their home and had these lessons, Paul's forbidding them to teach a man what Jesus said. Does that make any sense to anybody? Absolutely not, right? Use your heads. So this is false teaching. Paul has a false teaching, not something you know. It's just by common sense. If you know something Jesus said, you have a duty to teach it, not keep it to yourself and exclude men from your communications. What he's saying is it makes it sound like the woman has something over the man. Well, you know what? Maybe she knows something he doesn't. He's a big boy. He can handle it. So this is false teaching. Clearly on its face, false. Now go up here back to the keep silence in the churches. Now, there is no commandment in the law, what Paul's saying here, okay? And so he says it's in the law, but it's not in the written law. And we're going to have to figure out, where did he get this from? So the answer is the oral law, probably. Okay? And I just want to make another point here, is he's not saying this is a woman to keep silent in the churches. They're not entitled to speak. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine operating a church where you told the women you have to stay silent sitting in church? Only your husbands can talk? I mean, that's horrific. But this is a tradition of Phariseeism. Okay, and so I want to just back out and show you that is still a tradition to this day, that the women have to sit separately from the men. Now, I don't know that the Jewish people take the view that the women can't talk, but I have a feeling the point of separation is so that the men can talk and debate things with the rabbi, but the women are supposed to stay silent on their side of the aisle, so to speak. So let's just see what Jewish people are doing, and you'll see this is tradition, not the God's law. Okay, so I don't go to Jewish synagogues, so I don't know about this. So I'm trusting that Jenny knows what she's talking about. She's summarizing Judaism in an article, and the question she asks is, where do they worship at? And she says they worshiped in synagogues. Usually men and women sit separately. And so I'm going to assume, I've kind of heard that indirectly, so I'm going to assume this is a current practice. And this is just simply, and I think it was at the time of Jesus too, don't know, but it's clearly a practice now, and it derives from Phariseeism. This is what they decided, that men and women had to sit separately, and that's why they sit separately. It could be that this was to make women not speak up and let the men talk, and they could sit on one side, and if they chatted and talked to the rabbi, it wouldn't encourage the women to think they could do so, and so it could kind of keep them from talking. Probably. And that maybe is what it is. And that would be what? This would be tradition, or what's also called halakha. These would have been teachings of the rabbis, and we're going to get into that in a second. Okay, so where does this idea of separating men and women in synagogues come from? So this is kind of the only thing I can find that's even similar to what Paul said. So I just want you to know, I'm digging in there to see, is there anything about women not being able to talk in church?
I don't see it, but you could make the argument that it follows from separating women's seating positions. So that's maybe what's going on here. So let's look at that. It's called gender separation in Judaism. In Judaism, especially in Orthodox Judaism, and Orthodox are who? This is the name of the Pharisees of the old era. So the Orthodox are the same as the Pharisee party of Jesus' era, okay? Basically. And they admit that. That's what they're proud to tell you that. Okay, so it's not a disputed question. There are a number of settings in which men and women are kept separate in order to conform with the various elements of halakha and to prevent men and women from mingling. Other streams of Judaism rarely separate genders any more than secular Western society. So it's Orthodox, not other kinds of Judaism. So it's Phariseeism. So remember, Paul's a Pharisee, and now he is calling it a law that women must be silent in churches. And I'm assuming and inferring that it comes from this rule about sitting separately. And he's endorsing this idea of silence, probably from this rule about sitting separately. Okay, and Rabbi Menachem Posner will give us from Chabad. He's a staff editor at Chabad.org, a mainstream Jewish good website for Jewish things if you want to understand things. And halakha refers to Jewish law, so they call it law too, okay? And I assume Rabbi Posner is a Pharisaical or Jew, meaning he's an Orthodox Jew. The literal translation of the word halakha is the way, and it guides the day-to-day life, and he tells you this is how it's done. So it's the Talmud, which is a compendium of these halakha, meaning just traditional laws, understandings by the rabbis. They would have a debate among the sages, and the halakha is ultimately decided in favor of one specific tradition. So they'll have a little forum, they'll debate the issue, and then they'll pick which view to take going forward. He then says, how is this determined? For the most part, the halakha follows the majority. So in the debates, it would be the majority of the sages would rule or be considered the principle going forward. But at the same time, certain sages are considered to be more authoritative in a specific area of the law. So it could be different. If you had a very strong, very knowledgeable sage, that could trump all the other people who don't know as much as that sage. So he's basically showing you that it's like an elder system where certain traditions are being handed down that are not directly based on the Bible necessarily, but based on some sort of tradition. And it's also known as the oral Torah, although it's very much written down anyway. So, okay, so I hope that explains that. And let's go to the next slide. Okay, and so we're trying to prove what is Paul relying upon for this idea that women have to be silent in churches. We've determined that the only thing closely related to that is women sitting separately from men in synagogue. And presumably there could be gender restrictions on speech in that context, because now you can control and know whether the women are speaking up because you can hear the sound coming from one side of the room. And so that could be exactly what they're doing in there. We don't know because I don't go to Jewish synagogues, so that might have been what it was in the past. Maybe they allow women to speak now in their churches, in their synagogues, whatever. But it's coming from what's called halakha. So it's called law, but it's not the nomos. It's not the Torah. So they don't use the same word. They use a word that means actually the way, halakha. And I just want to give you an example. Rabbi Posner is going to say that it has the Mishnah Torah 14-volume encyclopedic repository of Jewish law codified by Rabbi Moses Maimonides from the 13th century AD. So, there's all kinds of other works. So this is probably what's coming from. And therefore, Paul is saying this tradition of being silent in the church is actually, he said, came from the law, but it's not the law Torah. It's this kind of law. So Paul, as a Pharisee, still has in his head that the law is this, what's also known as the oral Torah. And so it's not really oral. It's written down as well. But so I think it's misleading to say it's the oral Torah. It's a Torah other than the Torah. Okay, so it's another set of rules that are in writing, and they call it the oral Torah, but it's actually just more human, non-divine words that are taken as authority, and that's what Paul's relying upon. And so he is definitely not following the rules of Jesus, because Jesus is excoriating the Pharisees for making up all kinds of doctrines that detract from God's law, God's true words, such as, just so you know, the Korban. That was a payment. They said if you make this payment to the sanctuary for cash, money, it was a large payment. You could then be excused from your obligation to honor your mother and father in case they fell into poverty. You've now given enough money to the synagogue. The synagogue can take care of your parents when they get ill or sick. So you're out of the box. You don't have to honor your mother and father in case of illness. We've got that covered. And Jesus said, this is wrong. You can't take away the duty to take care and honor your mother and father. You can't let them fall into poverty simply because you made a significant korban payment to the temple, not to the temple, but to the synagogue's treasury. And so you can just see, though, what there's financial money going on, and maybe some corrupt motive too. The synagogue wants to raise cash. How do we do it? We'll promise to take care of mom and dad when you get old, and they get old, and we'll take care of it. And basically you'd get a certificate. You would excuse you from any further obligation to your mother and dad. It's now the synagogue's obligation. These are the kind of things that Jesus said, no way. You're making of none effect the law of God. So anyway, that's what so Jesus is excoriating these principles of the Pharisees. And so we're going to see so next time we're going to just digress a little bit, and we're going to go into a doctrine of Paul that comes right out of Orthodox Phariseeism. I mean, he has so many things. The predestination doctrine, that was Pharisees. But he has a doctrine about Gentiles and their reading the law, and whether it's something they should do or shouldn't do. And that is similar to this command to women that you will not speak up in church because the law says you can't do that. And so Paul's, when he's screaming and yelling in Galatians chapter 3, do not read this law. When he screams and yells in Romans that it's killing you, the letter of the law kills you. Literally, that was the doctrines of the Pharisees only to Gentiles. They were told, you can't read the law. It will kill you if you read it. We'll read it for you, and we'll tell you what commands apply to you. That was the Pharisee doctrine. Paul doesn't even have that. He doesn't have any rules they should read, and he scares them to death about reading it. So we're gonna digress because it's important. And what did Eisenman say? We need to extract anything that's put into the New Testament that would make anyone think less of Jesus, that he would associate with or endorse something like Paul. Jesus Christ would not endorse someone who's into halakha, who's studying the doctrines of the Pharisees, who are perpetuating the doctrines of the Pharisees, which, by the way, includes predestination. That was a Pharisee doctrine. Does not allow for this doctrine about women having to be silent in churches, and definitely does not have the doctrine that the Gentiles cannot read the law, and it's dangerous for them to do so, which is definitely a Pharisee doctrine of yesterday and still to this day. And Paul reflects clearly Pharisee doctrine. Do not, as a Gentile, read the law. That is not for you to do. We'll give you what laws you need to read. And it's just going to be basically Noahide laws. That's what the Jews of today would basically more or less tell Gentiles about. Okay, God bless. I hope this helps, and it's going to be an exciting, important episode next time. Take care. God bless. Ciao.